Imagine not being able to go to the hospital when you are sick. Imagine your children not be able to gain education. Imagine suffering from an endless hunger. What if I tell you that all of that misery is caused by social inequality and poverty? Would you believe me? Social inequality had existed from generations to generations, but as the government tried to reduce the social gap, the gap is still far beyond extreme. In fact, the richest 1% of the world still has twice as much wealth as 6.9 billion people. Furthermore, social inequality also exists in many other spectrums, such as education, how 1 out of 5 children cannot be able to go to school, or in terms of healthcare, how 10,000 people die each day because of the lack of the facility of the hospital. The Honorable Judges, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Davendra Aryasatya and I'm from 3 State Senior High School. Today, I will deliver my speech entitled Social Inequality and Poverty. In my speech, I will divide it into 4 parts. The first one is what poverty looks like in Indonesia. The second part is how did the government respond to social inequality. The third part is the alternative solution, and last is the conclusion. Without further ado, let's jump into the first part of my speech. Poverty is a state where a human being is unable to fulfill their basic needs both socially and economically. This includes not having any literal education, lack of food and clothing, and also not having any proper shelter. The bigger the number of poverty could lead to the worst social inequality. In 2017, Indonesia had suffered its worst poverty at 10.12% of its people, and 25 million people are living under the poverty line. Based on UNDP, the regions that are suffering the most from poverty are Bali, Nusa Tenggara, and also Papua. There are 6 types of poverty: situational poverty, generational poverty, absolute poverty, relative poverty, urban poverty, and last is the rural poverty. However, the main cause of poverty in Indonesia is the rural poverty. But what is a rural poverty? Rural poverty is a poverty that happens in the rural areas. It happens because there's the unequal distributions of the welfare by the government to these people living in the rural area. In fact, the people living in the rural area are suffering from poverty with the rate of 14% of its people. Meanwhile, the people living in the urban area are only half of that. This shows that the government had been too focused on building infrastructures and not being aware about the people living in the rural areas. Now, after knowing what poverty looks like in Indonesia, let's move to the second part, which is how did the government respond to social inequality. Social inequality is formed through the unequal distributions of the income of its society. The government had tried to reduce this gap by imposing more taxes to the rich people. But there were a few problems with this effort by the government. The first one is how the rich people can easily escape this tax, or they do tax evasion. Because of the law doesn't impose that much punishment to the people that are offenders, the rich people can simply accept this punishment, or they can just hire a private financial advisor to help them escape this tax. The second problem is how the government is unable to equally distribute this tax money to the people. Because of the rich people usually wanting to see some transparency by the government, they usually influence the government to make some infrastructures in the urban areas and also metropolitan cities like Jakarta. Now, the tax money becomes insufficient to be distributed to the poor people, and poverty happens all over again. This shows that the government hasn't been able to find the right solution to solve poverty and social inequality. That's why in the next part I will give you the alternative solution. Firstly, social inequality and economic growth has an implicit link. But what is an economic growth? Economic growth is when a country is having more gross domestic product, or as you know, as GDP, than they had the previous year. In order to improve the GDP rate of the country itself must improve the income per capita of its society. And how do Indonesia do that? In order to do that, Indonesia must open up to investors in order to gain many more job opportunities for its people. And note that the industry that is offering them the job usually doesn't have lots of requirements. Because for example, these industries are like fast fashion clothing or shoes company. This can create the accessibility of the people that in rural areas doesn't have lots of ability to gain the job itself because the job doesn't have lots of requirements and now they can have a better job. Secondly, when we have more company, there will be more taxes that will be imposed by the government to these companies. Now, it will be more likely for the government to distribute the tax to the poor people because now the one who is asking for the transparency itself is the poor people because their land is being used for the industry itself. But to be more precise, the government needs to improve in the educational sector of the people that are living in the rural area. For example, they can do this by making more schools in Nusa Tenggara, for example, so that people in the rural area can be more educated. By having to invest inside of the education, now the government itself can have the better improvement to the social inequality because its people has more sustainable life. The third solution is the tax policy itself. I think that if the government makes the tax policy more strict, it can be more effective because now we can impose more tax itself. Because currently, in the current condition, people are actually escaping this tax so easily because there's no strict law itself. But how can the government imply a strict law? They can simply have more punishment to the tax offenders so that the offenders itself can have more deterrence itself. When this happens, the tax itself can become more effective. My fourth solution is the charity itself. By having the charity, us as the people can also contribute to the poverty itself. We have charity that is actually being made by the community and also by the government. We can donate by sparing our money and giving them to the people that are in need through this charity. We also can donate as a form of the worship, for example, as we're the Muslim people, we can go to the mosque and donate it to the Amal box. Or if you're a Christian, you can go to the church and donate it to the people that are needed and getting blessed by the priest itself. So, by having that four alternative solution, I think that the social inequality and poverty would likely to be solved inside Indonesia. In conclusion, to be able to have solved the social inequality and poverty, the government needs to be more aware and we as the community need to also contribute and donate our spare money to these people that are in dying needs. Together we stand to solve poverty and social inequality. Together we can do it. Thank you.